This podcast was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Wurrung and the Bunurong. We'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging.
From the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, this is PsychTalks.
Hi, and welcome to a new series of PsychTalks created by the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. I'm Cassie Hayward, an Associate Professor here at the University, and I specialise in applied psychology and behaviour change. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Professor Nick Haslam. Nick is a social psychologist with expertise in areas of stigma, psychiatric classification and mental health. How's it going, Nick?
Very well, thanks, Cassie. It's great to be back and I'm excited for what's ahead. And just like our last series of Psych Talks, in each episode we'll be chatting with a psychology expert about their incredible new research, and we'll be uncovering important insights that you can apply in your everyday life.
Sounds good. And with the 2024 Olympic Games just around the corner, we thought it would be the perfect time to delve into the world of performance sport. To help us explore the unique challenges athletes face and how they manage their mental health in such high-pressure environments, we're joined by Dr Courtney Walton. Welcome, Courtney. Thank you for joining us for Psych Talks.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
As we're gearing up for the Olympics, I think it's interesting to reflect on how we view athletes in society. And I think we often see them as at their peak of physical fitness and getting sponsorship deals and all these amazing things. So what led you to thinking that maybe we need to delve a bit deeper into their mental health?
Yeah, I agree. There's been a perception that due to maybe all of the great physical traits and kind of physical wellness that we see, that will translate naturally into mental health and well-being. And we're getting more and more understanding that that's not necessarily the case. There's kind of this idea, I guess, something I see is almost like athletes not as people, more as kind of characters, part of like the theatre almost as a performance. And so something I think that's really important, really interesting is starting to get a sense of what's the human behind the elite athlete, the professional athlete, and what is their mental health experience.
Do you have any evidence for the rates of mental health issues in this group? Is it something that most elite athletes will have to deal with at some point?
Yeah, we're getting better and closer, I think, to understanding what that looks like. There's so much heterogeneity, though. The differences in terms of rates vary based on all sorts of things. So that might be in different sports, in different countries, across gender. So there's all these sorts of things that can affect what those rates look like. But broadly, where we kind of see it at the moment is that elite athletes are at similar risk, if not slightly higher risk than general rates in the community. So a recent position paper had, they cited about half of athletes will experience a mental health disorder during their career, and about a third kind of currently meeting criteria for a mental health disorder. So that is slightly higher than what we might see in the general population.
But that's a remarkably high proportion, really, especially if you buy into that idea that these are superhuman, invulnerable people, as you say, barely ordinary people at all. So what's contributing to those high rates? Is it related to performance in terms of the pressures of performing at high levels at all the time, or the constant evaluation, concern about what might be live after they finish, after their time in the spotlight's over? Or is it just ordinary life pressures that we all experience?
Everything you've just said and more, really. There are so many different things that have started to be associated with worse mental health outcomes. Part of that is just the human experience of things going on outside of sport, but there are also many things that are kind of very relevant in elite sport that tend to be maybe triggers or on average associated with worse outcomes. So there's the performance part of this. So we know that kind of going through disappointing performances, especially in the context of things like Olympic periods where there's a 4-year build-up, it's not week to week like there might be in football, for example. But then also aspects about the individual, their kind of coping mechanisms, things that they might be doing in terms of sleep, alcohol, all of those kind of general health factors play a big role. And then there's kind of also really important things in terms of team environments. So what do we know about the team context that individual might be in, whether they're in an individual sport or a team sport, they're kind of embedded in an environment. And so we're starting to focus much more on what can we do to make those environments healthier and more productive and promoting better mental health outcomes? Because I think even those outside of sport can probably see historically we've probably leaned on maybe not so helpful strategies to try and motivate excellence and motivate growth. Maybe we can create healthier environments where athletes are actually enjoying being there and supported and able to thrive, and that can transition into better mental health outcomes.
Sounds like something a psychologist could help with.
Yeah, exactly.
What are some of those differences between individual and team sport issues? I think we can all imagine the pressure of an individual runner or swimmer on their own event, but then we can also imagine the pressure of a team environment where someone might, as they would say, let the team down. So what are some of those pressures that athletes face in those different kind of modes of performing?
Yeah, I know it's probably a frustrating answer with all of these. There's always it depends in terms of the athlete and how they process their experience, essentially. But we can say that on average, we tend to see athletes in individual sports having worse mental health outcomes than those in team sports, and there's probably a few different reasons for that. But one of the things that comes out over and over in all of the research that we've done and others have done is the role of social support and feeling supported in those environments is critical. And so typically, not always, but often people in a kind of healthy team environment will have more of those supports than maybe, as you say, someone in an individual sport who's spending a lot of time maybe more in isolation, or when they are with other athletes, it's maybe with competitors or people they're competing for a position rather than teammates. And so that's kind of an important thing that plays out in the individual and team sport aspect.
And do you see are coaches and teams and sporting institutes set up to help athletes with their mental health and provide that support? Is it getting better, or have we still got a way to go with that type of training and preparation for athletes?
We're definitely getting a lot better. I would say, I'm relatively young, so I can only speak to what I kind of am familiar with, but it seems like things are growing and changing really rapidly in terms of people's understanding and awareness and respect for this as being an important thing to focus on. And I think a lot of that's probably happened due to the kind of public nature of some people's experiences. There's been some pretty prominent athletes who've spoken about their experience very openly, and I think that's really pushed things in a positive way. But generally, it does feel like, at least here in the Australian context, most professional sports and elite sports are really trying to do what they can to create better environments and to try and find ways to support athletes when they are experiencing difficulty.
What are the best things that they can do? What does your research say is kind of best practice for those types of teams and sports centres? What should they be doing?
Yeah, so a big part of that is around having systems in place to know how to respond when there are difficulties coming up. And so we're seeing much more of a push towards having mental health professionals, typically psychologists, embedded within sports environments so that they actually have someone there who can manage these things and knows best practice ways to respond, because not that long ago that would fall on the coach to do those sorts of things. We're also kind of seeing there's a real value on having clear external referral pathways. So very often athletes will say, well, there is a psychologist in my team or the organisation, but I don't want to speak to them. I'd rather get a referral to go somewhere else away from my sport. Other athletes will say the complete opposite. So again, it depends. But having access so that athletes can access, okay, is there someone in this environment who can support me? Or if I don't feel comfortable, is there somewhere externally that I can go to be supported? So that's kind of in terms of the response part of this, in terms of helping people when maybe the distress is already occurring. But there's also much more we can be doing in terms of, as I said, trying to make environments where maybe mental ill health is less likely to be occurring. And I think that's where there's lots of work there to do to figure out just how to do that effectively.
Concretely, what do you think could be done more at this point, based on what we now know from the sort of science you do?
Well, I'll come at it from two ways. One of the things that we're really interested in is understanding this concept of psychological safety in elite sport. It's kind of an area that I think there's a lot of relevance here in terms of actively creating environments where one kind of psychological harms or kind of negative behaviors are being reduced, are being called out and cut out and removed from these environments, but also where we're starting to explicitly help people in terms of things like mental health literacy, so that they can understand better what is anxiety about my game on the weekend, what is high stress because of the pressure that I'm facing at the moment, and what is signs of a depressive episode, right? So that we can start to separate those things. That's a really difficult thing to do for psychologists, let alone coaches and athletes. And then also starting to affect things like help-seeking pathways and stigma reduction in those environments, because that's often been a really key barrier that people have spoken about is, yeah, I had this experience for years, but I didn't think I could talk to anyone about it because I'm going to lose my spot in the team, or I'm not going to be seen as tough enough, resilient enough, and then how am I going to be viewed by others? So I think that is starting to change, but it is, of course, still there to some extent. And then I think in terms of the finding ways to have people who are well equipped to deal with this embedded in the environment more is critical. So I actually think Australia is quite good at this, but I'm often shocked seeing overseas job advertisements for head of psychology at a leading Premier League club or something 1 day a week for £25,000 or something like a very, very low salary relative to what's required to do that job. And so this is kind of, I see a bit of a problem where there's not maybe the emphasis placed on this that we would put on strength and conditioning and physiotherapy and every other area of supporting athletes. So trying to invest more, and I'm aware of my bias because I am one of these psychologists, but I do think trying to make it more fundamental and more embedded part of these environments.
And just going back to something you said about teaching athletes about stress and anxiety, I guess the other challenge there is some of that they need to perform, right? You have to have some level of anxiousness or stress about an event. So is it also about teaching them what's the right amount or the right type of stress to be feeling and where it might tip over into something that they might need some help with?
Definitely. I think that's a really validating and important part of that work is understanding many of these experiences are expected. You know, it's a kind of normal human response to the situation that you're in. And I think that's why it's often very important for people doing that work to have the understanding of elite sport environments and these contexts, because any kind of intervention or any kind of work that you're doing with an athlete needs to account for the fact that they're in an incredibly unique and unusual environment that's maybe not that applicable to other contexts. And so, yeah, all of that work around managing stress and anxiety is very different when it's, taking a penalty in front of hundreds of millions of viewers is going to cause some significant anxiety.
Yeah.
That'd be almost as bad as giving a lecture.
Some might say it's easier than giving a lecture.
Courtney, so far we've been talking about elite adult athletes, preparing for the Olympics or whatever, or taking a penalty shot. But I know you've also looked at the challenges of elite youth athletes and some of the challenges that can bring up. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the research you've done in that youth space?
Yeah, so I became really interested in this because I guess I was kind of aware that there's this growing, pretty significant body of research now looking at elite athlete mental health. And there's always been a pretty good body of research looking at mental health in kind of community sport and youth sport that's maybe more participation focused, community focused, and all of the kind of positive things that come from that. And there's kind of this gap in the middle almost of young people who are involved in youth sport, but at a very high level, very competitive. And what does their mental health look like? And so that's some research that I'm doing with some collaborators over at the University of Toronto. And we're doing that at the moment to kind of work with elite youth athletes to understand what do they feel. We're trying to really put them at the center of that research, and what do they really feel like we need to be researching? What are the things that are most important to them? And so a lot of the kind of early things that are coming out are around, similar to what we were talking about, educating people in those environments to help them. So coach education, having people like mental health champions in those environments. But in terms of that research more broadly, or that kind of area more broadly, there's a really interesting paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago looking at kind of high-level Australian Football League youth players and then comparing them on a whole range of outcomes to community sport. And basically showing that the high-level talent development pathway athletes are doing better on most measures, which is really interesting, I think, and probably speaks to the fact that, yes, they're exposed to incredible pressure, a lot of demands, but they're also really well supported. So kids in those pathways, or adolescents in those pathways, are getting great speakers coming in, they're getting referral pathways, they're doing workshops, they're kind of getting everything that they need, at least maybe more than others. And that can probably act as a really important protective factor for those young people as well.
So that's a success story maybe with the AFL. Do you think youth sporting organisations in general are getting the message? Are they recognising the importance of mental health for young athletes, or do you think there are some shortcomings in how they're doing that?
I think so. I feel like generally in our community where the focus on youth mental health is really prominent, and the impression I get is that youth sports clubs are trying to do and want to do the best that they can to support young people. I think the hard thing is, how do they do it? A lot of those, especially community sports clubs, they're not necessarily well funded. They're relying on a lot of volunteering from parents, from so on. And so adding this incredibly complex and difficult thing to their responsibilities, to their requirements, is difficult. And so I think at the moment there's lots going on in terms of the research to understand how can we better support these clubs to support young people, because it's such an important opportunity. There's I can't remember the rates off the top of my head, but there are a lot of young people involved in sports clubs. And so it's a really great kind of intervention option. And so it's just about trying to make sure that they have the resources and the best placed evidence to do that. And there's one of the kind of really difficult things on that we're seeing is there are so many people now offering mental health training, workshops, and very, very few of them are evidence-based. And that's really hard, because then you're putting that on coaches, parents, clubs to figure out, should these people come and give a workshop for our kids, or should we do it with them or with them? And so that can be a really difficult thing to do.
So that's some sort of resource limitations. I mean, are there also some cultural ones? So are there still people out there who think this is all unnecessary, it's making people soft, it's excusing mediocrity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Is that still a factor?
Yeah, I think there definitely is an element of that. But I think that's changing, and I think that's probably a generational change as well. There's an element of, in sport, you tend to see this pattern of players, and then they have it a certain way, and then they become coaches, and then they coach it the way that they had it. But that's where a lot of those attitudes can sometimes happen, because no fault of their own, a lot of those coaches had that experience themselves. Whereas now there's a lot more players coming out and saying, well, actually, maybe we could do things a little bit differently, and I want to take that into the way that I lead and the way that I coach. So I can certainly see that over time starting to change.
One thing we haven't gone into, if you don't mind, a very brief tangent. We haven't really talked about whether there are differences for female and male athletes through any of this, and how, and especially in the youth context, do you see differences in the approaches that work or that are tried, differences in the level of investment, differences in the receptivity of the athletes to these sort of interventions? Yeah,
so there's definitely gender differences that come out in a lot of this research. So I did some research a couple of years ago that looked at essentially differences in mental ill health and exposure to kind of negative experiences in sport. And for the most part, I guess the broad summary was that women athletes tended to report being exposed to more negative events and reporting worse mental health. We did a review recently looking at disordered eating and eating disorders in elite youth athletes. And again, there was a much bigger focus on young girls, but also that being kind of coming through as a bit of a risk factor. In terms of like investment, that's hard to say. I actually think there's probably quite a, maybe I have just noticed more of the investment into working with young boys in sport. And I think probably part of that is trying to make use of that environment as a really good space to try and teach young boys a little bit more about mental health and help seeking, try and break down some of those kind of gender norms that we can tend to see. So that's where I think there is kind of a lot of that focus on young men and their mental health, and sport as a kind of vehicle to try and change things. But broadly in elite sport, and this kind of typically speaks to the fact that in most sports, women athletes are just facing more barriers. And so, we've done research with women in a range of different sports who say, well, we're professional, and so we have professional expectations, but my salary is not professional and my supports aren't professional. But people expect me to go out there and put this performance that's not matched with what I see the men's team getting. And so that leads to a whole bunch of risk factors that can contribute to mental health in terms of balancing different demands, financial security. So those sorts of things definitely play out in the gender differences.
What about what parents can do for youth athletes? And I guess speaking on a range of youth athletes there, from participation in community sport through to high-performing young athletes. People might have seen the Italian tennis player Sinner thank his parents for not pushing him too much into tennis and letting him enjoy different sports. Whereas I think when we think of tennis parents, we think of those very stereotypical kind of pushing their kids into tennis, or dance mums, or whatever the stereotype is. But are there things that parents can do to help let their kids enjoy sport and pursue the high performance path if they want, but do it in a way that's healthy for them mentally?
Yeah, it's such a hard one. I'm always aware that I'm not a parent, so I don't have to face a lot of these difficulties. But essentially it is around trying to lean in on all of the positive things that parents can do to support young people in sport. So over and over and over again, you see research or you hear from young people involved in sport, the pressure placed on me through the things that my parents say, the things that my parents do, makes sport unenjoyable, leads to a whole bunch of negative kind of ways that we view ourselves going forward. They cause a lot of difficulty for young people. Whereas they also identify that parents can do all of these amazing things in terms of supporting, facilitating, and so it really does come down to, as a parent, can you find that balance between supporting a young people, encouraging them, showing them interest. I care about your sport. I want you to do well, and I want you to enjoy it. But I'm not so invested in the outcomes that how I perceive you is going to change based on wins and losses and things like that. Because I think you could go the other way, right? You see the very overly involved parents, but then also being completely detached and uninterested and uninvolved is a kind of different level of a kind of different side of difficult parenting in sport. So that would be the main thing. I know that's not a nice and easy fix, but it is really about just trying to support rather than dominate.
So letting them pursue their interests and supporting them in that way.
Yeah. And there's really very little evidence that kids going all out on one sport from an early age is going to lead to beneficial outcomes. In fact, it's more just associated with injury, with burnout, and with disengagement with sport. So where possible, encouraging kids to do a range of sports, the things that they want to do, that they're interested in, instead of getting too bogged down in that kind of single-minded focus on one sport from an early age.
So at the time of recording, the Olympics is coming up at breathtaking speed, and we're all going to sit back and enjoy it and watch lots of Aussie gold, etc. Is there anything we can do as sport consumers to contribute to the mental health of athletes? I'm sure many athletes get negative press, negative social media comments. I'm sure that does a great deal of harm. In fact, I know you've done some research showing it does harm. Is there anything else besides avoiding negative commentary that we can do as spectators and consumers?
I don't know if anything jumps to mind outside of that, but I do think that the central part of that is really important, is the social media side. We see it every major tournament, every Olympics. The Euros are on at the moment with the football, and I admit to being an England fan, but 4 years ago, we lost. England lost in the final in a penalty shootout, and the abuse that those players received, a lot of it racial, was just horrendous, like just awful. And so every kind of time this comes around, I think it is worth flagging and really emphasizing the role that, you know, you can just imagine the amount of comments and notifications and negative feedback that people are receiving. And so really trying to change and challenge that approach. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, what I said at the beginning, that I think it's very easy for us to fall into viewing the Olympics and these things as entertainment, which it is, but they are not characters, they are real people. And so trying to change the way that we talk about athletes, whether that's through social media, whether that's just the way that we talk in groups, as though disappointment at the Olympics is an incredibly difficult experience for someone that's dedicated almost everything to that for 4 years, adding on top of that a whole bunch of pile-on and kind of criticism because, you know, we see this getting worse now because of gambling, for example, right? So people are gambling on sports and then they lose and that's then the athlete's fault. And so we see a lot of criticism coming through that piece as well. So that would be my main thing. My main thing is trying to change the way that we talk about athletes.
Do you think clubs have a responsibility to manage those social media channels, or is it about advising athletes not to read it? I think a lot of those social media channels and platforms can be a pretty toxic space for anyone, but you can imagine the impact it would have on an athlete. What's the advice to athletes around that?
So difficult. A piece of research, I can't remember who it was, so I apologise, but qualitative research and athletes talking about, well, I can't avoid social media because I'm relying on my sponsorships to pay my bills, and I have to be on social media. I have to do X, Y, Z. And so it's very difficult to just disengage and avoid it because it's now just a fundamental part of your brand as an athlete, especially in things like Olympic sports where there isn't as much funding as professional athletes. So, yeah, it's difficult. I think there is more and more focus on educating athletes and coaches, who we haven't mentioned, but on how to navigate all of that. But it's very difficult, as it is we're seeing with just young people generally, and all of us really in navigating social media. Amazing
stuff, Courtney. We have to wrap up now so I can get to my second job as a soccer mum. But thank you so much for talking with us today. And I think everyone listening can maybe go into watching the Olympics with a little bit more compassion for our athletes now. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to PsychTalks with me, Nick Haslam, and Cassie Hayward. We'd like to thank our guest for today, Dr Courtney Walton. This episode was produced by Carly Godden with production assistance from Mairead Murray and Gemma Paprell. Our sound engineer was Elise Bradshaw. Thanks for tuning in, and we're excited to bring you more episodes of PsychTalks in this new series. So watch this space. Bye for now.